Hey, Masters of the Universe Classics fans, Scott Toy Guru Knightlick here with another inside look behind the scenes of this amazing line. Today, we are going to look at the challenges and advantages we had going into the line, creating a massive layout and rollout for characters. It all started with this document I prepared that was going to address the issues and really how to maximize creating a toy line that could encompass all Masters of the Universe storylines, worlds, characters, to create the biggest possible universe and biggest story. Now, obviously, Mattel was in this to make money. And if we could take everything that was Masters and not like Crisis on Infinite Earths and kill everyone, but rather mash it together, it was going to allow us the best advantage. Now, we didn't have a movie, we didn't have DVDs or a cartoon show, we didn't even have comic books, or let alone, we didn't have mini comics that we could pack in with the figures at first. So the first thing to look at is, what did we have access to? Well, not Filmation, and definitely not the 1987 movie. Those two were out right away. So what we could access were the original mini comics, from the very first one all the way to the last with the Snake Man. We had access to the original Princess of Power mini comics, all 8 of those, and all 4, New Adventures mini comics. But more importantly, we had access to a few obscure things, such as the 1987 licensing guide, which included She-Ra and all of the He-Man characters, as well as bios for them, which we'll get into that with the bio video later on. We also had access at the 2000X style guide and Bible. And another big one was He-Man.org did an interview with Ian Richter where he talked about the 3rd season of 2000X that never happened. Finally, we were able to get our hold of a lot of the early drafts and brainstorming notes from the vintage line. Luckily, many of the members of Mattel, like Tim Kilpin, for example, who was the general manager, he started off as the copywriter on Masters of the Universe, kind of like me. And he was able to pass me a lot of early notes that Mattel had access to and we could use as storyline basis for the Masters of the Universe Classics and as a basis for pulling characters. And this included the story Bible by Halprin that was used for the Filmation series. So at least we had some of those concepts. So one of the things I addressed in my memo were the challenges we faced. And a big one was the fact that we had King Grayskull and we had Hero, who originally were the same character, but the 2000X series established them as different characters. You also had things like the original mini-comics, which had the spirit of Grayskull or King Grayskull in it. So the idea of rectifying this was to make them 2 separate characters, where Hero was going to pass the power of Grayskull and the sword on to King Grayskull to make them both sort of, let's call it separate but equal characters that were tied into He-Man's origin, which from a product perspective was going to let us do both characters. We even did a little nods, like including the gravestone from 2000X as Hero's symbol. All right, Orko, another problem. So originally he was just introduced as a comedic relief character, but we wanted to make him more important and make his race, the Trollans, more important. So the idea that was thrown out in that original memo was to make Orko the whole time kind of a secret agent who was going to watch over He-Man. This was kind of inspired by an episode of the She-Ra series where Hordak tries to torture and read Orko's mind, and he can't do it. So the idea was Orko was a lot more powerful than people kind of gave him credit for. That's where that came from. All right, another big one was characters like the original Jungle He-Man that was in the mini-comics. We knew fans were going to want characters of him, and again, how do we merchandise this character and, yes, make the most amount of money? Because, yes, we could sell him just as concept He-Man, but if we made this character an original creation and gave him a name, then ideally he could be merchandised just like any other character. That was the idea. That's why we weren't just doing concept characters. Zodak, another example. So in the original series, he had a different spelling and a different ethnicity. And then in 2000X, he was African American and had tattoos and had kind of a different role. So again, the whole idea was to sell the most amount of toys. And if we made them two different characters, then we could expand the universe, have the greatest number of characters, and the greatest number of potential toys. That's what it was all about. Same thing goes with Green Goddess. We didn't want to just do her as like concept Teela, but establish her as an original character. Same with the Wonder Bread He-Man, or again, concept art for Skeletor and concept art from He-Man. By making these characters, we could sell them. Again, the He-Man Trio by Roger Sweet, another perfect example. So here we have the concept art He-Man transformed into Vicor, which was a merchandisable character, not just concept art He-Man. But, if you wanted him to be concept art He-Man, that was fine. Another thing was the two swords. So in the vintage line, there were two halves of the swords, and if they combined together, you could enter Castle Grayskull. And then there were also the whole two swords with Adam and She-Ra's sword, or Dora's sword. And then you had all the different colored swords. So how in the world were we going to get all this together? Well, the idea was that He-Man's sword was going to get passed down to the different protectors of the sword. So it would become the Sword of He. And each character who was a protector, it would change to the color that they wanted it to be. And that would explain all the colors. And why the sword changed color over time based on who was wielding it at the time. Another issue we had was She-Ra was not in the 2000X series, but we did have the Horde in the 2000X series. And there was a whole thing where the Horde were banished to Despondos. So the idea was, well, let's just stick Etheria in Despondos and make it this beacon of light in this otherwise dark dimension. And that was a great way to bring in She-Ra. All right, and then finally, New Adventures, how to link this in with the rest of the continuity. And this one was actually pretty simple. The idea was just to have the New Adventures guys show up and recruit both He-Man and She-Ra to come help them win their outer space adventures. And it was a great way to include She-Ra in that New Adventures era and continue her story. So with all that, we had to create, or rather, I had to create a lineup of all the characters now that we knew we could use. And the reason we wanted to do this in the beginning was we wanted to make sure each year was very strong, and we weren't going to burn through characters too quickly so that we could get to everyone we had access to. Eventually, we got access to the Filmation characters, but the first time, that's why there was a lot of notes on this, because I needed to revise it several times, including when we realized, I think in 2013, that the cost to make these figures was sort of outpacing what fans were going to pay, and we had to sort of trim it down to the most essential characters possible. But it was very important to have a master list of everyone we did have access to and ways to make these characters merchandisable to keep the line going as long as possible. And that's why the master rollout list was created. And that was about it. And we had a roadmap. We knew which characters we had access to. We wanted to make the biggest Masters of the Universe line as possible. And by having this master rollout early in the process, it allowed us to follow it with, some adjustments as we went. But more or less, it became the battle plan on how to do this. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more behind the scenes about Masters of the Universe Classics and others, please leave some comments, subscribe to this channel. I would love to do more, and keep talking toys with you.